NHS has already been heavily privatized over the last 40 years.
I was just about to get onto that point.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
The waste from administration is going off the chart. There's a guy in that, I think is it David Prager, his name is, who was in that documentary we saw, and he said at one point, he said, well, what do you do if you want to make something, you know, uncompetitive, if you want waste and you haven't got any wasteful jobs around that you can waste this money? Well, what do you do? Well, you make them up.
People in charge of hospitals, people in charge of universities, now they want to think of themselves as if they're big executives. They want to act like CEOs or executive vice presidents of a major corporation. Well, the first thing you need, if you're a big shot like that, is flunkies, you know? So you need to have 5 or 6 people under you, and each of those guys needs to have 5 or 6 people under them to make them feel important. The problem is, what is there for those guys to do? You need to make something up. Now, what that almost invariably means is make up something for the people who are actually doing the work to do, which makes it more difficult for them to actually do their work.
This is what's been going on for 3 to 4 decades. It's been systematically made, by the look of it, more and more expensive and less less efficient, with the outsourcing of simple treatments, for instance, making simple treatment of procedures cheaper, but then leaving the really expensive treatments to the NHS and to us to pick up, you know, where they can't make the profit from. One of the things that was outstanding to me was not just how they're selling it off, but also then selling it off. And there was one statement that from one of the guys in the documentary that said, we subsidise these industries that we are privatising. We're selling it off, and then even then sending them more money and subsidising as well. So obviously, you know, getting the financial figures of this is going to be an absolute nightmare. But Dr. Bob and they've done a great job, haven't they, putting this together?
Absolutely. And they show how it's a process that has continued step by step. So they refer to Oliver Letwin. So Oliver Letwin is one of the key figures, a Tory grandee, if you like. He's still around.
John Redmond was the other one, wasn't he?
Yeah, John Redmond, Oliver Letwin. Oliver Letwin wrote a book years ago. People can look it up. It'd be expensive to buy now, I think, but they can look it up. It's called Privatizing the World. And in it, he notes that certain things are quite popular, services are quite popular. So you can't just in one fell swoop, especially if you're in a country like Britain, for example, where it's not like, let's say, a complete dictatorship, as it were. You can't in one fell swoop privatize these. What you have to do is you have to go step by step. And that's something that Margaret Thatcher discovered. And so they describe how each government, and let's not forget, when we say government, it's not just the executive branch, number 10, number 11 Downing Street. It's Parliament, right? So it's Parliament that are passing changes in laws, right? Yeah. And they describe how, and of course, because we live in a parliamentary state, you know, the government, the executive branch have the political party which has the most seats in Parliament are the ones that then take over the executive branch, but they're still in Parliament as well, which is why you can pass about like 97% of all legislation that is proposed by the governing party, if they have a majority, just passes. Right? Yeah, there'll be debate back up and forth, but unlike in the United States, say, where you have more separation of powers, so it's like more closer to 50%. So in Britain, it's you know, close to the high 90s, precisely for that reason. And they point out how each era, under each prime minister, under each government, certain things were done, and that paved the way for the next government to do the next sets of things. So the idea of the internal market is introduced during the Thatcher era, right? So before that, what you had was you know, a health authority that would have covered a certain geographical area. And there'd be a couple people there, maybe an accountant, a medical professional, public health expert, secretary. And it's their job, based on specific formulas that have been designed for everybody, to look at their region. What is the population? What are the needs? You know, the age demographics, deprivation, poverty, things like that. And then they come back, they'll send that data up to the Department of Health and be like, this is what we need this year. And they get that from the Department of Health. And then they distribute it, and that's that. There is no market, there is no profit and loss, there's no finance department as such. It's certainly not as they exist today, right? A GP has somebody, they come to them, if they present with symptoms that require a referral to a hospital, they refer them to the appropriate place. And then that's it, right? That's the system as it worked for the first 30 years, right? From like the late 40s when the NHS was first implemented up into the 1980s. And then what we get is this internal market that's created for no reason, right? No obvious reason. And what it said is that, oh, what we're going to do is we're going to take the so-called or supposed efficiency of the private marketplace. We have all this competition where businesses have to compete and individuals have to compete, and therefore you get theoretically at least a better product, a better good, a better service because you have all this competition. We're going to introduce this, force it into a national health service. So that means you end up having prices start getting associated to all kinds of things that weren't there before. Instead of the boards of hospitals being made up of doctors and nurses who work at that hospital and therefore have a direct, shall we say, they're directly impacted by the consequences of their decisions.
Of course,
right? Of
yes.
how well the hospitals run. The boards, then these hospitals turn into trusts, and then the boards become corporatized, right? This is under Thatcher's era, right? So bit by bit, all these doctors and nurses get pushed out and replaced by people literally from like the business world and what have you, people who know nothing about medicine and who aren't directly impacted by the decisions they make. So that was a stroke of genius, right? Now there could be ways to improve the system, maybe have more stakeholders, community members also on the board, the way you might have set up a jury by random selection, right, from the community. You could have something like that, right, to democratize even further so that hospitals are even more sort of there for the masses. But that's not what happened. It went the opposite direction. Other things started to be introduced as a result of the internal market, sort of competition, GPs started to be given funds on the basis that you'd be called a fund holder. So a GP could say, write a letter to a hospital and say, I'm not happy with something that's going on with your hospital, so I'm not going to refer patients there unless you change X, Y, and Z. So all of a sudden you have to react differently to patients being sent to you by a so-called fund holder GP. It made absolutely no sense because first of all, it's not like there's 50 hospitals in the same area. Where are you going to send your patient? But as Dr. Bob explained it to me, he said, look, in practice, for the first few years, nothing changed necessarily with the treatment, but what it did was start to instill the psychology of the marketplace and competition into people and start pitting people against each other. Instead of doctors and nurses and patients all working together as they once did, all of a sudden you end up creating bureaucracy. Also, you need a massive bureaucracy gets created to monitor this.
And you get the whole bureaucracy surrounding, we've got to reach these targets and those targets, and it becomes more about hitting numbers on a balance sheet than it does become about Auntie Mavis who's in bed 3 who needs her pan changing. You're going back there, if you don't mind. I'll just give you a perfect example of how efficiency has been made less efficient, and how they're almost draining the system of resources, these private enterprises. My back, my subscribers will know I've had a problem with my back, and I just needed to go to a chiropractor and give me a bit of an adjustment. That was it, 40 quid for it would have done it. The NHS won't do that. They sent me to a private hospital with an MRI machine outside the hospital, which was brought on a trailer specifically for me that day. There was nobody else, and they went and they did an MRI of my back. I could have told them I did tell them all along. I just need my back cracked. That's all it was. I went for it was a course of physiotherapy that they sent me on, a month course before that, and I was saying just crack my back. So I went on the course of physiotherapy and the MRI. And eventually I had the results back. We can't find anything. I ended up going up to my chiropractor, £45, bang, 15 minutes, my back was sorted. But all of that money was extracted and just sucked out of the National Health Service. Why? Because they've set up the system to funnel people who have problems with their back down a path of treatment that they necessarily don't really need. However, it's cheap. I don't know, MRIs aren't cheap, but physiotherapist maybe. It's cheaper to do it through a Virgin physiotherapist than it would be for the NHS. And this is, from what I can see from my own experience, how they're doing it.